Hello and welcome to today's CDCT live session. My name is Jason Rader and I'll be your host. Today's session is on securing the edge. And with me today, I've got a couple of experts that are going to help us go through this journey. We've got with us Reece, who's a senior architect here with us at CDCT. And we have Larry Lunetta, special guest, a VP of Wireless LAN and Security Solutions Marketing at Aruba, a Hewlett Packard Enterprise company. Welcome, Larry. Welcome, Eron.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this topic is, I think, going to be a fun one for us to cover, but I want to make sure we kind of put the reins around it right now. What do we mean when we're talking about securing the edge, or what do we mean when we talk about the edge in general? Larry, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, I think the edge continues to change, right? And security used to be about moats and castles and protecting from the outside in, right? Well, that's a very tired cliche, and it's been tired for a while. But what we've seen now over the last 9 months with the pandemic is that what was perhaps a somewhat defensible perimeter based on being in the office and on campus has completely been obliterated. And now we have remote workers, and this idea that there's any sort of discernible edge is gone. So that has finally, I think, buried this idea that you can somehow ring fence a set of assets and protect them that way. And then the other thing that was happening alongside of this for a while is IoT, right? And the idea that, I just bought a set of lights for my office, right? And they're connected to the internet. So this idea that there are so many points of entry now that the edge really is, really gets down to the individual entity.
Absolutely.
Eron, anything to add?
Yeah, I believe the discernible edge used to be anybody coming in, right? From the internet/firewall DMZ perspective. But your edge is also internal, right? I mean, you have the khaki principle of, hey, just wearing a pair of khakis and looking like I'm supposed to be here means I can plug into the wall and get on the network. And that is your edge as well. A lot of people don't see that, even your internal network, but within your four walls, like Larry highlighted there, is still your edge network. Essentially, any access point or ingress, right, is now the edge. And when you start to take that beyond just providing that network connectivity and that IP address and me being able to pass traffic, there's also that idea of trust, right? So ultimately, am I doing or do I have the access I need to perform my job and not enough access to be malicious?
Got it. No, I appreciate that. I almost thought of the Matrix there. It's like there is no spoon kind of thing. Everything's the edge or there is no edge kind of thing. But I think that whole aspect of, it's fuzzy. We're not going to be able to dig this moat around the entire entity anymore. It's going to be, we've used the term islands of security previously. I think, and you kind of delved into it a little bit, Eron. Why security at the edge harder? You talked about that trust aspect.
So essentially, Larry brought up IoT, right? We've all heard the scary story of a network being compromised because a thermometer in a fish tank in the lobby needed internet access to, or at least network connectivity, so that we could remotely manage it. But that, so simply put, my network can be very secure from an ingress perspective or from outside the world, but that little thermometer has its vulnerabilities, and once I've compromised it, I have all the network access that it had, right? And if it has carte blanche access to the network, then ultimately I've compromised the network.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to note that from an IoT perspective, these things come onto the network outside the purview of IT, right, and security. We hear of professors in universities taking Raspberry Pi experiments and giving them internet access and things like that. So, the first problem is knowing what's on the network, right? And that's a non-trivial task that really requires a lot of technology to look at internet traffic or network traffic and characterize what's there for the reason that Eron mentioned, which is once you understand what's there, then you need to decide what kind of access it gets. And, typically, and this is, part of sort of the overall edge challenge is typically it's been a VLAN assignment that has provided the access rights to a particular device or user. And what we've seen in certain instances is we've gone into a branch or a retail store and we've seen literally hundreds of VLAN assignments, different VLANs that have to be managed because each of the elements that are connecting has a different set of permissions. So that's almost a non-starter in this world of the infinite edge, right? You have to have a different technique. And the idea of identity, driving access is, I think the way you can solve this problem where I authenticate, or even a device that you can get a MAC address or something like that, you can get some sort of identity information and then associate a policy, right? And it's that centralized management of policy that allows you to both manage access and, if you need to, change access if something's been compromised. So this, the edge has really put a focus on what has traditionally been called network access control, but which is really identity-based, permissions and IT access.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
Rewind 20. Yeah, I was going to say rewind 20 years, and we weren't worried about what those devices, or a little bit further maybe, but we weren't worried about what those devices needed access to. We were worried that they needed access, right? We needed cabling, we needed whatever to get this device on the network. And Larry's hitting the nail on the head when it comes to now we're looking at role-based access control, right? So that I don't care how many, I don't care what VLAN I'm on, right? I could literally be in the same VLAN, same octet of a forgive me, network space, right? Subnet, and ultimately you and I have completely different access rights according to the way we identified, authenticated, and even further authorized, right? So what type of device I'm connecting to the network today? What time of day is it? Where am I connecting from? Am I connecting from wireless? Am I connecting from an AP that's, within the lobby or maybe back in the data center? And does that change my access rights, right? And ultimately, that's where I'm going with it is before it was just providing that network connectivity. Now it's a matter of securing those folks and really getting into I hate to breach this topic maybe early, but zero trust, right? Into a zero trust network.
All right. So you let the cat out of the bag. We're going to come back to zero trust for sure. But I think you brought up a good point, because I think when we think about the three tenets of security, it usually is availability, integrity, and then confidentiality related to the order that people typically go. And you said it, Eron, is everybody was like, hey, we've just got to get connectivity. That was kind of the badge that IT departments wore, is, hey, we're making sure that everybody gets connected and to where they need to go. And that probably is what drove us to where we are now, with either untenable numbers of VLANs or just people all on the same VLAN having that availability. So how do we unwind this? What are the techniques for that?
Well, I think Eron talked about using identity as really the key to assigning policies and permissions, right? And he talked about that being a variable, right? So let's loop back to the remote worker, right? I had a set of permissions based on my identity in the office. Do I carry the same set of permissions working from a bedroom in my home, right? And the answer may be yes, maybe no, depending on how I've been enabled to access the network. In some cases, you can project the corporate SSID into the home and apply the same security policies seamlessly. In other cases, I may be just VPNing in and being dumped into the intranet. That may enable me to have different kinds of permissions. So it really gets down to knowing who I am, having a policy associated with that based on the circumstances that Eron talked about in terms of the device I'm using, the location I'm in, the state of that device, is it trusted or not, all of those elements, and then continuously monitoring those circumstances to make sure I'm still entitled to those permissions.
Got it. So let's talk about zero trust, because now I just want to get into that topic, but I don't want to go there until we've kind of helped the folks out there know what we're talking about when we say zero trust. Who wants to take a stab at that?
Well, it's interesting. security has always been about an ecosystem of solutions, right? And what's happening now, and we're going to talk about this in the context of zero trust, is that organizations are looking more and more for the foundational products that they're buying, foundational technologies that they're buying, to get them further ahead from a security standpoint, instead of just bolting in a bunch of solutions, some of which are required and are fine. How much more can I get if my servers, have a foundation of security that I can trust, my network does, et cetera. So zero trust is a framework that's been around for, I think, 10 years now. And it is a framework. It's not a prescription, right? And there are a number of definitions associated with zero trust. NIST has one and is very helpful. Various analysts have them, vendors have them, depending on what products they sell. But the whole idea is that trust is not based on, again, what Eron said, it's not based on how you connect, it's based on who you are, right? So the fact that you can plug in into a switch or a port does not give you any access rights until and unless you're identified and those policies have been applied. So don't trust the network to enforce and locale to enforce security. Encrypt traffic is another basic principle. And the third is this idea of a trust broker, right? And think of it as where your policies are defined and where your access is essentially adjudicated in terms of what your identity is. So again, zero trust has a lot of different definitions in specific, but I think those are the key framework points. Eron, would you agree?
Yeah, let's be honest. Going back to my previous statement, we've been, these networks and or customer sites, et cetera, right? These infrastructures have been in place for who knows how long, right? And to take the position of now I need to know what these devices are, I need to know what's on my network, and I need to know those access rights. Going into a customer and doing these types of deployments, it's much easier for me to identify what all's on your network, right? Because ultimately, and that's a big eye opener for a lot of customers. We don't have any of that. We don't have Xboxes. We don't have PlayStations on our network. We don't, no. And then we end up finding all of those things for them, right?
Right.
But then here's the next step and the hard question, and that is, yeah, I want to segregate and create a role for my printers. But question number two is, so then what access rights, what does that printer need to talk to? What protocols does it use? And that's generally where we stop, right? Because they aren't fully aware. These devices have been online for years, right? So where do we take it to? And then the next step, determining what access rights these devices need. And we're talking IoT, we're talking devices that have been there for years. We're talking about CEO versus IT guy versus HR, right? All of those are huge factors that you now need to think about in a zero trust.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. When we start talking about data and security around data, there's lots of controls that you can put into place to protect data, but you've got to know the types, you've got to have the different classification levels. And those are the kinds of things that people think about sometimes after they've already tried to implement the controls. And what you're talking about brings up the same kind of conversation is, okay, we've got these controls that we can put into place, but now let's define the roles. Let's define the profiles that exist with the devices. How much of an effort is somebody looking at to be able to do that organizationally?
Larry, do you want to take that one, or?
Well, we can both. You're a practitioner, so I'll defer to some of your experience. But in general, let's go all the way back to the IoT example. So what you want to do is be able to look at what's on your network and easily cluster those devices into categories, right? So the first thing is, let's say I'm a hospital and I just installed 27 new MRI machines, right? I want to find them, and based on their similar characteristics, what applications they access, what their traffic looks like, I'm going to say, okay, let's put a box around that. I know they're MRI machines. Let's assign a policy appropriate for MRI machines. Once the 28th machine goes on the network, that's automatic then, right? Yeah. The policy follows sort of the identity of the device. For users, Same thing. You can set up groups, right? Executives, IT administrators. If you're, again, healthcare example, nurses, doctors, admins, and if you're in an admin category, you're not going to be able to see patient records, right? I mean, that's just part of how the role gets defined. So you can start off at a fairly high level, some of which is automated, and then over time you can implement different templates, and then those templates can be applied based on how you map individuals to roles.
But what about all those devices that have been out there forever, right? So HVAC, elevators, badge readers, printers, etc. Right? They've been there forever. It's much easier to address a new use case because I know what it needs to essentially as resources and access, and I can roughly outline that, much like Larry's talking about. I can start at a high level and bring that down, start to restrict it further. But when you're talking about networks that have been up for years and devices that have been online for years, in my professional opinion, your next step is behavioral analysis, and that is traffic analysis. So in other words, we're now where we really didn't care before. Now we're worried, okay, what does this printer talk to? How often? And let's trend that, and then we'll build an access model off of that. I would say that's the one that you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck for. But then you also have some of those use cases, that once a month this thing fires up a call to whatever and pulls its downloads. And we didn't capture that in the baseline. So now that's broken, right? So ultimately, there's not this is going to work perfect for everything. But you've got to start somewhere in it. And I think behavioral analysis is a good silver bullet for that.
So, I was going to say, I think that brings in, the other sort of current technology, which is AI, right? So building those baselines and looking at behaviors, those are artificial intelligence models, right? Where you're looking for, again, to your point, you're looking for the normal. And over time, a smart AI model should start to pick up that once a month you're going to phone to get a download. So that becomes part of the baseline, right? And then it becomes a matter of how much of a deviation from normal do you want to start to flag in terms of, looking for an incident or something like that. But it can go. AI goes all the way back to fingerprinting, right? Because the technologies that we use to fingerprint devices that we find on the network that we don't know what they are, is about looking at traffic and looking at, duty cycles, how much data is transacted, what applications, et cetera. And that's, we use AI to cluster those into similar groups, and then we can start to process the roles associated with them. So yeah, a lot of these newer technologies are all designed to deal with the volume and variety associated with this edge now, right? It's not just IoT, but now users are sometimes on campus, perhaps, sometimes remote, this hybrid kind of environment. Those baselines are going to look different depending on where you are.
No, I think that's great. I was going to ask, because for the people listening, that was one of those things of where going back and looking at the profiles and tuning them and tweaking them, that stuff certainly is possible for a team to do, but to have the advantage of the products having that AI and that inventory and that collection and the dynamic nature of how they can adjust those profiles is where that's going to make this a lot more, to that point, to get the most out of it, Aaron, to have it optimized. That's the way that it's going to have to roll. So what are the, I like to think about the concept of where we're going, because the stuff that we're talking about, AI and those kinds of things, is there the latest thing? I hear people talking about SASE and those kinds of things out there. What's on, that's a relatively newly coined term. Let's talk about that and how that potentially changes the game a little bit, and then where even we see the market going from that perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if you think about the genealogy of these frameworks, so Zero Trust started where the idea of the edge was more still associated with place, right? And applications were running in the data center. and there was sort of a thread that you could follow to make sure the security was intact. Now, roll forward, you've got a wholesale move to the cloud, right? Applications are moving from data center to AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, et cetera. And the security paradigm is now changing as well. And that's where this idea of SASE comes in. SASE stands for Secure Access at the Service Edge. And it incorporates, I think, three key elements. One is zero trust. So the principles of zero trust still apply. The trust broker, not trusting based on connection, but based on identity. That's one. But because the cloud comes into play, you now start to see SD-WAN become a critical component, because that's really where the edge meets the cloud, is at the WAN interface, right? So you have zero trust, identity-based principles. You have WAN optimization and WAN connectivity via SD-WAN, and then you're accessing assets and technologies in the cloud, and you're starting to introduce cloud-based security controls that, again, from a zero trust perspective, weren't anticipated. So, where SASE has extended zero trust is to incorporate now the cloud as part of the delivery mechanism for your security controls.
Nice. And that seems like a a concept and a technique and a technology that people would naturally need. Sometimes people kind of reject certain aspects, like folks like, oh, we're never going to the cloud, 5 or 10 years ago. And now we see where everybody is going right now. I mean, the way that the approach of SASE seems like it's a natural progression of everybody. There's a benefit regardless of the levels that we're talking about there.
Yeah, there's concepts from moving to a cloud, either public, private, hybrid, that have changed the mindset of the standard data center practices, right? What might have been arbitrary or unconfidential data in a multi-tenant environment now has to be encrypted, right, or now has to be restricted, even if, let's say, it's 100% private cloud, right? Because once again, it's all about zero trust. An analogy I've always used in reference to zero trust, or not zero trust, but even RBAC, role-based access control, or getting onto the network, is that 1920s speakeasy, right? You go to the alley and you knock on the door and the little slot opens up and the bouncer looks you up and down. Are you a cop? Are you a gangster? Are you even acceptable to come in here? That's that initial connection, and I would say device fingerprinting, or even looking at, like, let's say a Mac OUI. Once you open the door, the bouncer is going to frisk you, and that's your profiling. That's your further interrogation to make sure you're supposed to be here. But over the past few years, here's the next step. So now we know that's John. Let's say John comes in here all the time. It looks like John. It's John's height. He's male. He walks and talks like John so far. But then John ends up at the bar and he's ordering nothing but whiskey sours all night, when usually he's a gin and tonic guy, right? And that's behavioral analysis. So ultimately, the whole kit and caboodle of where before we didn't care what John ordered, right? But now we're watching what John does on a daily.
Yeah, Jason, I think you made an excellent point about this being a journey. And remember, these frameworks are not prescriptive. I mean, it's not like you can go buy one of these, and you're done, right? And you have to really pay attention to your architecture. You have to pay attention to your network architecture, your security architecture, and it's a considered choice as to where you put your controls. I mean, and it's going to depend on how much runs in the cloud, what your latency looks like, how sensitive your applications are to that, et cetera. We did some surveys of security professionals with the Ponemon Institute recently, and we asked about the adoption of these frameworks like zero trust. And it reflects this idea of journey. It turns out that about half of the respondents, and this was almost 4,000 responses, about half have adopted a zero trust framework and are implementing that. And about another 25% are planning to do that. But it shows that this is, again, not something you just do all at once, and it's not something that happens, again, prescriptively. The other thing about now adding the cloud is that identity has to carry, right? You cannot just say, to Aaron's point, you can't stop at initial time of access, and you have to carry that identity and that identity permission all the way through to the cloud, right? So that makes your SD-WAN interface a key component, and that's why Secure Access at Service Edge defines SD-WAN as a security element as much as an access element. And once you make identity sort of the talisman for control, as you continue to move from the edge to the cloud, that becomes a common denominator from a security standpoint.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Sorry, I was going to say this may be a little left field, but there's also some added benefits to all of this as well. Just from setting aside the security aspect for a second, we're really talking about automation here, right? So ultimately, what we're saying is, if somebody's plugging into a switch, if somebody's connecting to an access point, if someone's VPNing in either to a VPN concentrator for on-prem access or cloud or whatever, right? A lot of that was manual back in the day. So in other words, if I'm plugging in a printer, it's got to go into port 4 because that's the port that's configured for printers, right? Now what we're talking about is identifying or fingerprinting a device, profiling said device, and then making changes to the edge to support the access they need. Perfect example, I had a customer that had thousands of sites across the US, which were really management of malls and or shops, right? And they were averaging 12 to 15 hours a week in just iMac installs, moves, adds, and changes. And after we moved to an RBAC solution, we essentially saved them over 600 man hours in a year just on simply making VLAN changes to ports, right? So there's a lot of other benefit than just that security there.
I think you brought up an interesting point, both of you did, that kind of, I wanted to throw this out there. When we're talking about something like SASE that kind of deals with the cloud, that deals with the infrastructure component, that deals with the security component, those guys aren't always communicating on the back end. So this is as the journey progresses, and you'll see this more and more as we get to this kind of dynamic approach that we're doing in a lot of things. It requires a certain cultural change as well within the organization and coordination for them to be able to leverage the most out of these technologies.
Yeah, I think the point we talked about before, we're starting to see networking and security consolidating, right? That they're not separate elements. Even organizationally, we're starting to see less silos between the network operations team and the security team. And you're right. Integration is a really important part of this, and I think over time, the trust broker, that policy engine that is a key part of Zero Trust, becomes that integration point, right? Because that's where the identity store is, that's where the identity authentication happens, that's where the policies are set. And then communicating, whether it's a cloud-based control or an on-prem control, between the trust broker and the endpoints is where you get that integration that you need, because as we talked about, it's not a static problem. I can join and then be compromised, and we need to make the security adjustments based on some, either the cloud or a firewall or something else, sensing that.
But we're seeing those integrations. I think I'm seeing those integrations develop as we speak, right? Because a lot of these different architectures or infrastructures may master one skill, right? And be top of the quadrant in that perspective. They may not at all touch other pillars of the architecture. For example, rather than me trying to be eloquent here, I'll just say it up front. from an external or an egress firewall, I can tell you this device that's trying to connect to the outside world, I can see it as a malware bot. It is definitely malicious, right? And I can prevent him from getting outside the world. But what about my network, east-west, right? How do I kick him off the network? So integration with that egress firewall with, let's say, some type of NAC, right, that can go out and say, you know what, I know what that device is. I know where it's at. I'm going to go to the switch and literally shut off his port. I'll even blacklist him so he can't get back on the network, right, if he goes somewhere else. Those kind of integrations have been around for a little bit now, but I see that happening also within hybrid cloud solutions and even on-prem or even third party that manages a lot of that, but is completely outside of your cloud. You're doing this as a service, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the tendencies when you talk about secure access at the service edge. People forget about the service edge, right? And the idea that you can't send everything to the cloud to make sure it's protected. I mean, there's certain traffic, as Eron said, east-west traffic that never gets to the cloud. So you have to have this edge to cloud mentality about your protection scheme. And as I said, think about where you want your controls to be based on the application architecture, the network architecture, et cetera.
If we think of the kind of the tipping point that happens with folks related to adopting new technologies and really getting to the level that we're talking about right now, what are, we've got business leaders that listen to this, we've got the tech folks that listen to this. What are some of the things that, advice that we can give, gold nuggets that we can give out to folks that are somewhere on the beginning of this journey, working their way towards that adoption, that we've been kind of referring to?
Don't start implementation at breach. If you haven't been breached,
generally a good,
where I'm going with it is, don't let your motivator be that you're on the front page of the newspaper that you've been breached. Start now, right?
Yeah.
Even if you're doing it in chunks and you're doing it in phases, you're starting, right? Versus you're being apathetic and no, that's not going to happen to us. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, I think this idea of phases is the right idea. Have an architecture, have an endpoint in mind that you want to get to. And it's not just a security architecture, it's a network architecture, it's an application architecture. They all have to fit together. And then, when we work with our customers, what they're most interested in is, what are we bringing to the table to get started, right? Is it all about somebody else's solutions, or are you giving us a foundation that we can build on from a zero trust perspective? And that's where this idea of, network access control, policy enforcement in the network infrastructure. Eron talked about the concept we call colorless ports, right? Instead of trying to figure out which color goes with which wire, it's all about what's the identity of that device that you're plugging in and what permissions are they assigned. But that doesn't come from a third party. That has to be built into the network. So, this convergence of networking and security is really an important point as you think about either zero trust or zero trust moving into a SASE kind of environment.
Got it. So exciting times are ahead, or right now, but including moving forward. I think with the nature of the whole remote workforce that is not going to go back, there's going to be something. It's never going to go back to the way that it was, for sure. We figured out how to do this. The technology exists. A lot of the technology is on the truck for some folks out there, and it's just a matter of an integration, either from a team perspective or a technology perspective. And I think the good advice that you guys gave is to kind of understand that journey, understand at least the things that are going to affect you later on in the journey, so that you can make good planning and good technology choices on the front end, even if that integration or the full optimization of that technology happens at a later point in the journey. Any final words from you guys? Eron, I'll let you go first.
I did echo there that this is, to me, this is important, right? Is that folks that haven't started down this journey, at least sit down and talk about it. At least, Larry kind of hit the nail on the head as well. organizationally, we need to get away from these pillar ideas of I'm network and that's my job, you're security and that's your job. They're both, right? And every day we keep moving forward, they're really just becoming, for a poor analogy, different parts of the Happy Meal, right? They all are essentially the same thing or the same goal, right? But those organizations need to tear down those pillars and start working in collaboration. And then I know I'm being reiterative here, but just because it hasn't happened to you yet and you don't have even if you think that 100%, I have no way of being compromised, it's going to happen, right? So be prepared to, and that's the other thing, back to zero trust. A majority of breaches don't happen from outside the company; they happen inside, right? So that's really, I think, the starting point from a zero trust perspective. I just because you work for me, just because you have a company asset, doesn't mean I should trust you implicitly, because I have no idea what your intentions are.
Yeah, I think the game changers now for security. I mean, the threat environment's always there. It's intense, and you have to protect yourself. The game changers are around COVID and the pandemic, right? One is the accelerated move to the cloud, which means that your security controls need to be reevaluated given that those workloads are moving, and that the edge is disaggregating at astonishing rate now because of the work from home. So your security policies associated with those endpoints also have to be reevaluated. And I will tell you that our customers don't feel comfortable with just simply a VPN tunnel into some gateway that dumps me or anybody else onto the network. That's really not the kind of security control you want. And that's why the idea of understanding identity and authenticating and assigning policy based on who I am is so essential, because working in the office is one thing, but what comes into the home via anybody else that's been on the network that could compromise me and things like that, it really intensifies this whole problem of, as Eron said, of not just access, but understanding the behaviors associated with me. So it's not just keeping the lights on that the businesses have to worry about from this new work style, this hybrid workplace. It's really the security controls that they're applying as well.
Yeah, I love it. From a final point perspective, I completely agree. We've kind of made it through, hey, we were able to push out these workers, and now we've got to then do the same type of due diligence that we did when everybody was somewhere else, and see where the gaps are, see the best ways that we can understand those identities and profiles of people, and then be able to control them in a very efficient and optimized way. Gentlemen, it's been a good discussion. I really appreciate the time. Larry, thank you so much for you and Aruba and HPE supporting us on this. Your opinions were spot on as far as the thought leadership that we needed for this session. And Eron, thanks so much for your customer-focused approach, and for, earlier I asked Larry to do some whimsical examples, and you definitely, with the Happy Meal and the Speakeasy, hit that mark. So thanks, man. If you guys would like to know more about what we do, please visit us at insightcdct.com. I'm Jason Rader. Thanks, and have a good day. Thanks, guys.